Swept into the prince's bed, a night of passion and love turns the waitress into his forever fiancé. Welcome, everyone. I'm so happy to have you here today. Before we begin, let me take a moment to speak a blessing over you. May your heart be filled with peace, your mind with clarity, and your life with endless love and joy. May every struggle you're facing be met with strength, and may your path be guided by grace and light. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, I have a very important question for you. Do you like my stories? Are they touching your heart the way I hope they are? Do you feel the passion, the love, the emotion? Am I on the right path with my work? I need to hear from each of you in the comments below. Your thoughts and feedback mean everything to me, so please don't hold back. I'm waiting to hear from you. And listen, don't skip this. This is a very special video that I know you're going to love. Watch and listen until the end, because you're in for something truly beautiful and unforgettable. Before we start, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss any of the stories and love we share here. Now, let's dive in. Bella had always believed her life in the enchanting city of Valoria was destined to remain quiet and uneventful, a steady rhythm of simple routines and polite exchanges. At 25, she had grown accustomed to the predictable hum of her days. Early mornings spent walking through the cobblestone streets, the crisp morning air brushing against her smooth brown skin as she made her way to the quaint little cafe where she worked. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries greeted her each morning as she unlocked the glass doors, her slender fingers twisting the key with practiced ease. Bella's beauty was the kind that turned heads without effort, a natural elegance that seemed almost unfair. Her deep brown skin glowed under the soft morning sun, and her dark, almond-shaped eyes sparkled with a quiet warmth that seemed to pull people toward her. Her hair was her crown, long dark locks braided into intricate, stylish patterns that framed her delicate face perfectly. Though she often received lingering glances and admiring smiles from the cafe's patrons, Bella remained modest, brushing off the attention with a shy smile and a polite nod. She had grown used to the admiration but never let it go to her head. Her life was stable, but it was also painfully predictable. Each day began and ended the same way, brewing coffee, serving pastries, and offering polite conversation to the customers who frequented the cafe. The walls of the cafe were painted in warm tones of cream and gold, the windows draped with sheer curtains that let in just enough sunlight to cast a cozy glow over the wooden tables. Bella's co-workers adored her for her gentle nature and quick wit, but none of them knew the quiet longing that lived beneath her calm exterior. Behind every smile, Bella dreamed of something more, a spark of magic that would sweep her away from the monotony of her daily life. She often imagined what it would be like to experience the kind of passionate love story she had only read about in books, where a man's gaze could make her heart race and his touch could ignite her soul. But those were fantasies, nothing more. She was a waitress in Valoria, and the closest she had ever been to royalty was watching the annual parades when Prince Max would ride through the city on horseback, his piercing blue eyes barely glancing toward the crowd as he passed. Bella had seen Prince Max only a handful of times, but even from a distance he seemed untouchable, an imposing figure with a strong jawline, perfectly groomed beard, and the kind of effortless charisma that left women breathless. There were rumors about him, of course, stories of royal scandals and whispered affairs, but Bella paid them little mind. Men like Max lived in a world far removed from hers, a glittering, opulent existence behind the guarded gates of the palace. Bella's life, by contrast, was simple. She lived in a modest apartment above a flower shop where the scent of fresh roses often drifted through the open windows. Her nights were quiet, spent reading novels under the dim glow of a bedside lamp or listening to the soft hum of rain against the glass. Love, Real love had always felt like a distant dream, until that one stormy night when fate decided to intervene. It was late in the evening when the storm rolled in, dark clouds gathering over Valoria like an ominous curtain. The rain began to fall in heavy sheets, drumming against the cobblestone streets and turning the quiet cafe into a sanctuary for anyone seeking shelter. Bella had just finished wiping down the last table when the front door swung open with a rush of cold air. She looked up, expecting to see one of the usual late-night customers, but instead her breath caught in her throat. A tall figure stepped inside, his dark coat slick with rain, droplets glistening in the soft cafe lights. He pulled back the hood of his coat, revealing a face so striking that Bella's heart stilled. His thick, dark hair was damp from the rain, strands curling slightly at the ends. His beard was neatly trimmed, framing his chiseled jawline. But it was his eyes that held her captive, deep blue, intense and piercing as they locked onto hers. Bella felt a strange flutter in her chest, a pull that made her feel breathless and unsteady. The man moved toward the counter with a quiet confidence that sent shivers down her spine. "Coffee, please," he said, his voice deep and rich, with the slightest trace of an accent that hinted at foreign royalty. Bella's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the coffee pot, pouring the dark liquid into a white ceramic cup. She glanced at him through her lashes, trying to steady her breathing. He leaned against the counter, his gaze never leaving her. "Rough night?" he asked, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Bella managed a soft laugh. "Something like that." She slid the cup toward him, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. A jolt of warmth shot up her arm, and Bella's breath hitched. The man's eyes darkened slightly, as if he had felt it too. He lifted the cup to his lips, his eyes still holding hers over the rim. "What's your name?" he asked. Bella hesitated. "Bella," she answered softly. His smile deepened. "Beautiful name," he murmured. Bella's heart raced as he took a sip of his coffee, the way his lips pressed against the rim of the cup, making her stomach flutter. She knew she should look away, focus on cleaning or organizing the counter, but she couldn't. Something about him held her captive. "And you are?" she asked hesitantly. His eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Max," he said simply. Bella's heart skipped a beat. Maximum. Her mind raced. There was only one Max who had those eyes, that presence. Prince Max. Suddenly, the realization hit her like a wave of cold water. Your Highness," she stammered, stepping back instinctively. Max's gaze softened. "Please," he said, setting down the cup. "Just Max." Bella's eyes widened as Max leaned closer, his voice low and intimate. "I hope this isn't the last time I see you, Bella." Her heart hammered in her chest as Max's fingers brushed briefly against hers before he turned and walked toward the door. As the bell above the door chimed softly, Bella stood frozen behind the counter, her hand pressed to her chest. She had served countless customers over the years, but none of them had ever left her feeling like this, like the very ground beneath her feet had shifted. Bella lay awake that night, her mind replaying the moment over and over. Maximum. Prince Max. He had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, like he had seen through her quiet exterior and touched the very depths of her soul. She traced her fingertips over her lips, wondering if he had felt that same spark when their hands touched. For the first time in years, Bella allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, her life was about to change. What she didn't know was that Max had returned to the palace that night, unable to stop thinking about her. His mind was haunted by the image of her soft smile, her captivating brown eyes, and the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. He had felt something that night, a pull, a connection, and deep down he knew this was only the beginning. It was late, the kind of late where the darkness seemed heavier, pressing down on the city of Valoria as sheets of cold rain pounded relentlessly against the glass windows of the small cafe. Bella stood behind the counter, the warmth of the coffee machine humming softly as she wiped down the polished surface with practiced ease. The low chatter of the last remaining customers had died down an hour ago, leaving behind only the quiet hum of rain and the soft glow of the streetlights reflecting on the wet, cobblestone streets outside. Bella's slender fingers tightened around the damp cloth as she sighed softly, her brown eyes drifting toward the rain-soaked streets beyond the glass. Her smooth, brown skin glowed under the dim lights, the soft sheen highlighting the graceful curve of her neck as the loose braids of her dark hair cascaded over her shoulder. She had always found comfort in the stillness of these quiet nights, but tonight felt different, charged somehow, as if the storm outside carried more than just rain in its wake. The door swung open with a loud chime, and a sudden rush of cold air swept through the cafe, making Bella shiver as she turned toward the entrance. Her eyes widened slightly as a tall figure stepped through the door, rainwater dripping from the hem of his long black coat. His movements were fluid, almost predatory, as he pulled back the hood of his coat, revealing a face so breathtakingly handsome that Bella felt her breath catch painfully in her throat. Dark hair clung to his forehead in damp waves, and his beautifully groomed beard framed the chiseled perfection of his jawline. His nose was straight and regal, his cheekbones sharp, but it was his eyes that truly arrested her, a piercing shade of blue that seemed to glow beneath the cafe lights, intense and searing as they locked onto hers. Bella froze, her heart hammering so violently in her chest that she could feel the blood rushing in her ears. He stood there for a moment, his gaze unwavering as the rain slid down the sleek fabric of his coat, pooling at his feet. Slowly, he stepped forward, the low sound of his boots against the polished floor making her stomach tighten. Bella's trembling hand reached for a clean cup as the man approached the counter, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and smooth as silk, curling around her senses like a slow caress. Bella nodded silently, her breath quick and shallow as she turned toward the coffee machine. Her hands shook as she poured the steaming dark liquid into the cup, the scent of roasted beans mingling with the faint chill of rain in the air. When she turned back toward him, her fingers brushed his as she set the cup down on the counter. A shiver raced down her spine at the warmth of his touch. Their eyes met again, and Bella swore the temperature in the room dropped despite the heat of the coffee machine behind her. "Thank you," he said, lifting the cup to his lips. His eyes never left hers over the rim as he took a slow sip, his gaze darkening slightly as if he were tasting something forbidden. Bella's mouth felt dry. She should say something, ask him if he needed anything else, but her tongue felt heavy in her mouth. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that made her stomach flip. "Do you work here alone this late?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with a quiet intensity. Bella hesitated, then shook her head. "No, my boss usually stays, but he left early tonight." The man's brow arched slightly. "Lucky me," he murmured. Bella's heart thudded painfully in her chest. He leaned his forearm on the counter, his long fingers wrapped around the cup as he studied her intently. "What's your name?" he asked. Bella swallowed hard. "Bella," she said softly. His eyes darkened slightly. "Bella," he repeated, as if tasting the sound of it on his tongue. His lips curled in a slow, devastating smile. "Beautiful name." Bella's cheeks flushed. She lowered her gaze, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was, how the scent of rain and something darker, muskier, lingered on his coat. "And you are?" she ventured. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. "Max," he said simply. Bella's brow furrowed, confusion flickering in her eyes. "Max," she repeated, the name feeling too familiar, too significant. And then it hit her, the realization slamming into her chest like a physical blow. Prince Max, the heir to the Valorian throne. Her lips parted as her breath hitched. Your Highness, she stammered, instinctively stepping back from the counter. Max's gaze sharpened, his smile fading slightly. Please, he said quietly, his voice a soft command. Just Max. Bella's heart raced as he leaned closer, his eyes gleaming under the low lights. I didn't expect to find someone like you tonight, he said, his tone almost contemplative. Bella's breath quickened. Someone like me? She asked hesitantly. Max's gaze traced over her face, lingering on the soft curve of her lips. Someone real, he said softly. Bella's chest squeezed painfully at the raw honesty in his tone. She had heard rumors about Prince Max, stories of royal affairs and scandals, but none of them had prepared her for the quiet vulnerability beneath his intense exterior. He reached out, his fingertips brushing the back of her hand. Bella, he murmured, his voice like a dark promise. Bella's lips parted, but before she could speak, the door to the cafe swung open, letting in another burst of cold air. Max's gaze sharpened. A man in a black suit entered, his expression tense as his eyes flicked toward Max. Your Highness, the man said with a stiff bow. It's time. Max's jaw tightened. He stood slowly, setting down the cup. Bella's eyes widened as he turned back toward her, his gaze locking with hers. Will I see you again? He asked, his tone low and urgent. Bella hesitated, her heart thudding painfully. I don't know. Max's eyes darkened. I hope you do, he said softly. And then, before Bella could gather her thoughts, Max reached out and tucked a loose braid behind her ear, his fingertips brushing the soft skin of her cheek. Bella's breath caught as Max leaned down, his mouth inches from hers. Good night, Bella, he whispered. And then he was gone, stepping into the rain with the smooth elegance of a man who had lived his entire life under the weight of a crown. Bella stood frozen behind the counter, her hand pressed to her cheek where his fingers had been moments ago. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths as the bell above the door chimed softly. Outside, the rain hammered against the streets, but all Bella could feel was the lingering warmth of Max's touch and the deep, quiet certainty that her life had just changed forever. 2 days had passed since that fateful stormy night when Prince Max had walked into Bella's cafe, and yet Bella could not stop thinking about him. The memory of his piercing blue eyes locking with hers, the soft brush of his fingertips against her cheek, and the deep, velvety tone of his voice when he whispered her name haunted her every waking moment. She had told herself over and over that it was nothing, just a chance encounter with a prince who lived in a world so far removed from her own that it may as well have been a dream. And yet, every time the bell over the cafe door chimed, her heart leapt painfully, hoping it would be him. It wasn't. The days drifted by with an unbearable sense of emptiness, her heart weighed down by the quiet ache of longing. Then, late one afternoon, as the sun began to set and cast a soft amber glow across the cobblestone streets of Valoria, a tall figure in a crisp black uniform entered the cafe. The man's expression was stoic and composed, the silver crest of the Valorian royal family gleaming on his chest as he approached the counter where Bella stood, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Miss Bella. The guard's deep voice cut through the quiet hum of the cafe. Bella's eyes widened, her breath catching painfully. Yes, she replied shakily. The guard pulled a dark velvet envelope from the inside of his coat and handed it to her with a formal bow. Bella stared at it, her fingers trembling as she took the letter, her pulse thundering in her ears. The seal bore the royal crest, a crown framed by delicate golden laurels. She broke the seal with shaking hands and unfolded the heavy parchment. Her breath hitched as she read the words written in bold, elegant script. Miss Bella, you are formally invited to a private evening at the royal palace, with His Highness, Prince Max of Valoria. Bella's heart stopped. Her legs felt weak beneath her as she read the letter twice, 3 times, convinced she was imagining it. The guard bowed slightly. "Shall I inform His Highness that you will attend?" Bella's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Yes," she whispered. The guard gave her a curt nod, then turned and strode out of the cafe, leaving Bella clutching the letter to her chest as her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. A private evening with Prince Max. Her mind raced. Why would he invite her? What could he possibly want with her? And yet, beneath the dizzying confusion and disbelief, a flicker of excitement burned in her chest. That evening, Bella stood before the full-length mirror in her small bedroom, her hands trembling as she smoothed down the rich fabric of the emerald green dress she had borrowed from a friend. It was sleek and elegant, the deep green silk hugging the curves of her figure, while the off-the-shoulder neckline highlighted the graceful slope of her collarbones. The color set off the rich warmth of her brown skin, giving her an almost regal glow beneath the soft light of her bedroom lamp. Her dark hair was braided into an intricate crown at the nape of her neck, with loose tendrils framing her delicate face. She wore subtle gold earrings that glinted against her skin, and a single gold bracelet on her wrist. Bella's hands trembled as she picked up a small tube of lipstick and brushed a soft crimson over her full lips. When she met her own gaze in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. A knock sounded at the door, and Bella's heart leapt. A royal carriage waited for her outside the cafe, gleaming under the moonlight as a footman stood at attention by the open door. Bella's heart thundered painfully as she stepped inside, the plush interior swallowing her whole as the carriage rolled forward toward the palace. The streets of Valoria blurred past her in a soft haze of flickering gaslights and moonlit cobblestones. When the carriage passed through the massive iron gates of the royal palace, Bella's heart seized painfully in her chest. The palace rose before her, a breathtaking vision of white marble and gold filigree beneath the star-strewn sky. Massive stone pillars framed the grand entrance, and tall, narrow windows glittered with the soft glow of candlelight from within. The carriage stopped before the grand staircase, and the footman opened the door. Bella stepped out, her breath catching as she lifted her eyes toward the tall figure standing at the top of the staircase. Prince Max stood beneath the soft glow of the palace lanterns, his black tuxedo tailored perfectly to his broad frame. His dark hair was swept back in elegant waves, and his blue eyes gleamed beneath the low light. His gaze darkened as it swept over her figure. Bella's breath faltered. Slowly, Max descended the staircase, his movements smooth and effortless, like a predator stalking his prey. When he reached the bottom step, he extended his hand toward her. Bella's chest tightened painfully as she slipped her trembling hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. "You look..." Max's gaze traced the curve of her bare shoulder, his thumb brushing lightly over the back of her hand. "Breathtaking." Bella's cheeks burned as her eyes widened slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. Max's lips curled into a slow, devastating smile. "Shall we?" he said softly, lifting her hand to his lips and brushing a gentle kiss across her knuckles. Bella's heart nearly stopped. Max led her through the palace's gilded hallways, his hand never releasing hers. When they entered the grand ballroom, Bella's breath hitched painfully. Crystal chandeliers glittered high above, their cascading light illuminating the marble floor below. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the moonlit gardens outside. A string quartet played softly in the corner, the sound of violins swelling gently in the air. Max turned toward her, his piercing gaze never leaving her face. He extended his hand again. "Dance with me." Bella hesitated. I'm not very good at..." Max's smile softened. "Trust me." Slowly, Bella placed her hand in his, and Max pulled her into his arms. His hand settled warmly at the small of her back, guiding her effortlessly across the ballroom floor. Bella's heart hammered wildly as Max's gaze darkened, his thumb tracing a soft circle against the curve of her waist. "You're different, Bella," he murmured against her ear. Bella's breath hitched. "Different?" Max's eyes gleamed. "I can't stop thinking about you," he whispered. Bella's heart stuttered painfully. Her hands curled against his chest as Max's gaze dropped to her mouth. Slowly, he leaned closer. "I haven't been able to think about anything else since the night I met you," he said softly. Bella's breath came in shallow gasps as Max's lips brushed the corner of her mouth. "Max," she whispered. His eyes darkened. His hand slid up the curve of her back, his fingers curling possessively against her bare shoulder. "Tell me you feel it too," he said. Bella's lips parted, but before she could speak, Max's mouth captured hers in a soft, devastating kiss. Bella's knees weakened as Max's hand tangled in her braids, his mouth molding against hers with quiet intensity. When he pulled back, his breath was ragged. "Come with me," Max said, his voice rough with desire. Bella's heart thudded painfully. "Where?" Max's eyes darkened dangerously. "Somewhere more private," he whispered. Bella's breath caught as Max's hand slid down to her wrist, his fingers tightening possessively. "I'm not letting you go tonight, Bella," Max murmured. "Not ever." Bella's heart skipped painfully as Max's mouth brushed her ear, and then he pulled her toward the shadowed archway at the edge of the ballroom, leaving behind the glittering chandeliers and the soft strains of music as the night wrapped around them like a dark promise. The night air was thick with the sweet scent of jasmine and roses as Max led Bella through the palace gardens, his hand firmly intertwined with hers. The moonlight bathed the marble paths in a soft, silvery glow, the flicker of lanterns casting dancing shadows across the hedgerows. Bella's heart pounded wildly as she followed Max down the winding path, her emerald green dress whispering against the stone beneath her feet. The night was still, except for the rustle of leaves in the light breeze and the quiet hum of the palace behind them. Max stopped beneath a trellis of white roses, the delicate petals glowing like pale fire under the moonlight. Bella's breath hitched as Max turned toward her, his piercing blue eyes dark with intensity as they swept over her face. He lifted a hand, his thumb brushing lightly against her cheek. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured, his voice low and rough, sending a tremor down Bella's spine. "I just need to know if you feel this too." Bella's breath hitched as her eyes widened, her lips parting in stunned silence. Max's gaze softened as he traced the curve of her cheekbone with his thumb, his hand sliding gently into her braids. "Tell me, Bella," he whispered, his mouth so close to hers that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Bella's heart thudded painfully as she stared up at him, her pulse racing beneath the weight of his gaze. Her voice broke, her breath shallow and uneven. Max's gaze darkened, and in the next moment, his lips captured hers in a soft, searing kiss. Bella's knees buckled as Max's hand slid down her back, drawing her flush against his chest. His mouth moved over hers with slow, devastating precision, coaxing her lips to part beneath the gentle pressure of his tongue. Bella's breath stuttered as Max deepened the kiss, his hand curling possessively around her waist. Heat flared through her veins as Max's tongue brushed against hers, the kiss turning desperate and consuming. Bella's fingers curled into the lapels of his jacket, clinging to him as the ground beneath her seemed to tilt. Max broke the kiss with a low, ragged breath, his forehead resting against hers as he struggled to steady himself. "Bella," he whispered, his voice dark with restrained hunger. "I want you." Bella's heart thundered painfully. Her lips were swollen from his kiss, her body trembling beneath his touch. "Max," she breathed. His hand slid down to her waist, his thumb brushing the exposed skin beneath the hem of her dress. "Say yes," he growled softly. "Come with me." Bella's breath shuddered as Max's gaze seared into hers, raw with desire and need. Slowly, Bella nodded. Max's eyes darkened dangerously as his arms tightened around her. Without another word, he lifted her effortlessly into his arms. Bella gasped as Max carried her through the darkened garden, the warmth of his body pressing intimately against hers. The path blurred beneath them as Max strode toward the palace, his hold on her unyielding. Bella's breath caught as Max pushed through a side entrance, the heavy wooden door swinging shut behind them. The cool marble of the palace corridors passed in a hazy blur as Max carried her toward the grand staircase, his jaw tight and his gaze burning with fierce intensity. Bella's arms tightened around his neck as Max ascended the stairs 2 at a time, his grip on her never faltering. Her pulse quickened as Max turned down a long corridor lined with gilded wall sconces and tall arched windows. The heavy double doors at the end of the hall stood ajar, and Bella's breath hitched as Max pushed them open with one hand. The room was massive, the high vaulted ceiling adorned with intricate gold detailing and a massive crystal chandelier. Heavy velvet drapes framed the tall windows overlooking the moonlit gardens below. A large bed with silk sheets and a dark canopy stood at the center of the room, the soft glow of candlelight casting flickering shadows across the polished marble floor. Max crossed the threshold and set Bella down at the foot of the bed, his hands lingering at her waist as his gaze swept hungrily over her flushed face. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her parted lips. Bella's breath stuttered. "Max." He leaned in, his mouth brushing against the shell of her ear. "I need you, Bella." His hands slid down her back, pulling her closer until their bodies were pressed together. Bella's breath caught as Max's lips found hers again, the kiss dark and consuming. His hand slid beneath the thin fabric of her dress, his touch igniting a fire beneath her skin. Bella's knees weakened as Max's mouth traced a path down her jaw, his lips ghosting over the sensitive skin of her neck. Her head fell back as Max's hand traced the curve of her hip, his touch firm and possessive. "Tell me you want this," Max murmured against her skin. Bella's breath hitched. "I want this," she whispered. Max's eyes darkened. He slid the thin strap of her dress from her shoulder, his lips following the path of exposed skin. Bella's breath shuddered as Max guided her backward toward the bed. Her knees met the edge, and Max followed as she sank onto the silk sheets. His mouth found hers again, his kiss deep and demanding. Bella's arms wrapped around his neck, her body arching beneath him as his hand slid up her thigh. "Max," she gasped as his mouth claimed hers again. His jacket hit the floor with a soft thud as Max's hands slid beneath her dress, peeling the fabric from her body. Bella's breath stuttered as Max's gaze swept over her exposed skin, his eyes dark with raw need. "You're mine," he growled, his mouth finding the curve of her shoulder. Bella's breath hitched as Max's lips blazed a hot trail down her collarbone. His hand tangled in her braids as he pulled her beneath him, his body pressing her into the silk sheets. "Max," she whispered, her fingers trailing down his chest. Max's mouth found hers again, the kiss slow and devastating. "I've wanted this since the moment I saw you," Max murmured against her lips. Bella's breath stilled as Max's hand slid down her back, his mouth claiming her in a deep, possessive kiss. Bella's fingers curled into his hair as Max's mouth traced a path down her throat. "I'm not letting you go," Max whispered against her skin. "Not now, not ever." Bella's heart stuttered painfully. "I don't want you to," she breathed. Max's gaze darkened. His hand slid down her thigh, pulling her flush against him. His mouth found hers again, deep and claiming. Bella's breath broke beneath the weight of his kiss, her hands curling against his chest as Max's body pressed her into the silk sheets. "Fine," Max growled against her lips. Bella's breath hitched as Max's mouth claimed her once more, his hands sliding possessively down her back. "You're mine, Bella," he whispered, his breath rough against her skin, "and I'm never letting you go." Bella's heart soared beneath the weight of his words as Max's mouth sealed over hers once more, his kiss dark and consuming as the night wrapped around them in a haze of silken warmth and moonlit desire. Bella stirred beneath the soft silk sheets, the golden morning light slipping through the tall arched windows of the royal chamber and casting delicate patterns across the luxurious room. The warmth of Max's strong arms wrapped around her bare shoulders made her heart flutter. Her smooth brown skin glowed under the golden rays, and the soft scent of Max's skin, a mix of sandalwood and spice, filled her senses. Bella's long lashes fluttered as her dark brown eyes slowly opened, her gaze landing on Max's beautifully sculpted face. His beard was slightly rough against her cheek as he leaned down, brushing his lips across her shoulder. "Good morning, my love," he whispered, his deep, silky voice vibrating against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. Bella's heart skipped a beat as Max's hand traced the curve of her hip beneath the sheets, his fingers drawing lazy patterns over her warm skin. She turned toward him, her braided hair cascading down her back as Max's piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, filled with tenderness and raw devotion. Bella smiled shyly, her fingers brushing over the rough stubble on his cheek. "Good morning," she whispered. Max's gaze darkened with affection as he leaned in, pressing a lingering kiss to her lips. Bella melted beneath his touch, her hand sliding to the back of his neck as his mouth moved slowly over hers. "I could wake up like this every morning," Max murmured, his thumb brushing across her jawline as his lips trailed down her throat. Bella's cheeks flushed as Max's strong arm pulled her closer, his body heat seeping into her skin. For a moment, it felt like the world had melted away, leaving only the two of them entwined beneath the soft sheets, the sunlight bathing them in a golden haze of warmth and contentment. But the sound of footsteps echoing down the marble hall shattered the intimate moment. Bella's eyes widened as Max sighed heavily, his forehead resting against hers. "I suppose the palace is awake," he murmured. Bella's heart quickened as the heavy knock on the door echoed through the chamber. "Your Highness," a deep voice called from behind the closed doors. Max's expression darkened as he pulled Bella tighter against him. "Ignore it," he whispered against her ear. Bella's lips parted, but the knock sounded again, sharper this time. Max sat up, the sheets slipping down his chest to reveal the toned lines of his muscular torso. Bella's breath hitched as she admired the way the sunlight kissed his skin, but the sharpness in Max's gaze pulled her back to reality. "Enter," Max commanded. The heavy doors creaked open and a palace guard stepped inside, his gaze averted as he bowed low. "Your Highness, the Queen requests your presence in the royal hall immediately," the guard said carefully, his eyes flicking nervously toward Bella, who was still curled beneath the sheets. Max's jaw tightened. "Tell her I'll come when I'm ready," Max said coldly. The guard hesitated before bowing again and retreating from the room. Bella's heart pounded as Max ran a hand through his dark hair, his expression hardening. "Max," Bella whispered. He turned toward her, his gaze softening as he leaned down, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Stay here," he said softly. "I'll handle this." Bella watched as Max pulled on a robe, his broad shoulders flexing beneath the heavy fabric. His piercing blue eyes darkened with resolve as he turned toward the door. "Whatever happens, Bella, you're mine," he said firmly. "Don't forget that." Bella's heart thundered painfully as Max left the room, the door closing softly behind him. Down the grand staircase and through the gilded corridors of the palace, Max's footsteps echoed with sharp precision as he strode toward the royal hall. The double doors swung open, revealing the queen seated on her golden throne, her expression cold and severe. "Max," the queen said sharply, her eyes narrowing. "We need to talk." Max's jaw tightened as he stepped toward her. "If this is about Bella..." "Of course it's about Bella." The Queen's voice sliced through the air like ice. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The entire court is in an uproar. The future king of Valoria, caught with a common waitress in his bed." Max's eyes flashed dangerously as he stepped toward the throne. "Her name is Bella," he said, his voice low and threatening. "And you will speak about her with respect." The Queen's gaze darkened. "She is beneath you, Max. A woman like that has no place in this palace, let alone in your bed." Max's hands curled into fists at his sides, his breath hissing through his teeth. "I love her." The Queen's eyes widened in shock. "What?" Max's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. "I love her," he said again, his voice steady. "And I'm going to marry her." The Queen's mouth tightened into a thin line. "You would disgrace this family." "I would save it," Max cut her off, his voice ringing through the hall. "Bella has more grace and strength than anyone in this court. She is kind and honest, and I will not let her be cast aside because of outdated traditions." The Queen's gaze darkened. "Max, enough." Max's voice was like steel. "I'm not asking for your permission." The Queen's eyes flashed with fury as Max turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Bella sat at the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as the door to the chamber burst open. Max stood in the doorway, his eyes blazing with fierce determination. "Max," Bella whispered. Max crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands framing her face as he knelt before her. "Bella, listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's going to be talk, there's going to be backlash, but I don't care." Bella's eyes filled with tears. "Max, I'm not letting you go," Max said fiercely. "Do you understand me? I don't care what anyone says. I love you." Bella's heart swelled painfully in her chest as Max's hands slid down to her waist, his gaze burning into hers. "I told the Queen that I'm going to marry you," he said, his voice dark with certainty. Bella's eyes widened. "Max, you don't have to be afraid anymore," Max whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. "Because from now on, you're mine. Forever." Bella's breath hitched as Max's mouth captured hers in a fierce, possessive kiss. Bella's arms slid around his neck as Max pulled her flush against him, his body radiating warmth and strength. "I love you, Bella," Max whispered against her lips. Bella's heart raced wildly as she whispered back, "I love you too." Max's arms tightened around her, his mouth finding hers once more as the golden sunlight filled the room. The storm outside the palace might have only just begun, but inside Max's arms, Bella knew she was safe. Max had claimed her, and no force in Valoria, no queen or court, would ever tear them apart. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the vibrant blooms of the palace gardens, casting a golden hue across the stone pathways and delicate petals of roses and jasmine that lined the walkways. Bella's hand rested lightly in Max's as they strolled beneath the arching trellises draped in ivy and fragrant blossoms. The warmth of his touch sent a soft shiver up her arm, but the weight in her chest refused to lift. The elegance of the palace grounds, the grandeur of the marble fountains where crystalline water cascaded over sculpted figures of angels and gods. It all felt too overwhelming, too unreal. Bella's smooth brown skin glowed beneath the soft sunlight, her dark eyes downcast as her stylishly braided hair caught the golden light, making her look ethereal against the lush backdrop of the royal gardens. Max glanced at her, sensing the quiet tension in her silence. His beautifully groomed beard framed the sharp perfection of his jawline, and his piercing blue eyes softened as he studied her delicate profile. Bella's fingers trembled slightly in his hand, her gaze fixed on the ground as if afraid to meet his eyes. They reached the stone bench beneath a massive willow tree, its cascading branches swaying gently in the breeze, and Max guided her down to sit beside him. Bella's eyes shimmered with uncertainty as she looked out at the picturesque beauty surrounding them. The manicured lawns, the vibrant bursts of color from the flower beds, the distant sound of birdsong mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. But none of it calmed the growing storm in her heart. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle hum of the garden. He turned toward her, his brow furrowing at the tremor in her voice. "What is it, love?" he asked softly, his fingers brushing over her knuckles. Bella swallowed hard, her dark eyes lifting to meet his gaze. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice breaking as her breath hitched. "I'm just a waitress, Max. I'm not royalty. I'm not one of them." Her gaze dropped to her lap, tears blurring her vision. "People are already talking. The Queen hates me. The court looks at me like I'm some kind of scandal. What if they're right?" Max's jaw tightened, his expression darkening with a mix of frustration and fierce protectiveness. He shifted closer, his hand sliding beneath her chin, tilting her face toward him. "Bella," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "look at me." Bella hesitated before meeting his gaze, her breath catching at the intensity burning in his piercing blue eyes. "Do you think I care about titles?" he said, his thumb brushing softly across her trembling lips. "Do you think I care where you came from?" Bella's lips parted, but before she could speak, Max leaned in closer, his forehead pressing gently against hers. "You've captured my heart, Bella," he whispered, his voice thick with raw sincerity. "From the moment I saw you in that cafe, you've owned me. Do you understand that? You've owned me completely." Bella's eyes filled with tears as Max's hand cradled her cheek, his thumb wiping away a stray tear that slid down her smooth brown skin. "I don't care about the court's opinions. I don't care about my mother's anger. The only thing I care about is you." His voice deepened, his tone edged with quiet desperation. "You make me feel alive, Bella. Before you, my life was empty. Duty, expectations, nothing real. But you're real. You're the only thing that matters." Bella's heart pounded painfully as Max's gaze burned into hers, the sheer depth of his affection and vulnerability stripping away the last of her defenses. "But what if they try to stop you?" she whispered, her hands resting against his chest as his heart thudded beneath her palms. "What if—" "Let them try," Max interrupted, his voice dark with fierce determination. "I'll fight for you, Bella. I'll burn down this entire kingdom if it means keeping you." Bella's breath hitched as Max's mouth descended upon hers, capturing her lips in a slow, deep kiss that melted every doubt and fear into nothing. Her arms slid around his neck as Max's hand tangled in her braided hair, his kiss deepening with raw hunger and tenderness. "Let me love you, Bella," Max whispered against her lips, his breath ragged. "Let me show you that you belong with me, not because of a crown, not because of some title, but because you've made me whole." Bella's tears mixed with his kiss as her hands tightened around his shoulders, her heart shattering and rebuilding all at once beneath the weight of his devotion. "I love you too," she whispered, her voice breaking as Max's mouth pressed softly against her trembling lips. Max's hand slid down to her waist, his grip tightening as he pulled her into his lap, his forehead pressing against hers. "Say it again," he demanded, his voice dark and rough with need. Bella's smile trembled as her fingers brushed through his dark hair. "I love you, Max," she said again, louder this time. Max's eyes darkened with intensity as his mouth found hers once more, his kiss searing and possessive. "You're mine," Max murmured between kisses. "Forever, Bella. No one will take you from me." Bella's hands cupped his face as their kiss deepened, her heart racing wildly as Max's hand slid over her hip, holding her tightly against him. The The sound of the palace bells chiming in the distance barely registered as Max's lips claimed hers over and over, his breath ragged with the force of his devotion. "I love you," Bella whispered once more, her voice breaking as Max's arms wrapped around her, holding her close beneath the willow tree's swaying branches. Bella melted into him, her heart thudding as Max's kisses slowed, his lips brushing over her jawline and down to her shoulder. "I'm not letting you go," Max whispered. "Not now, not ever." Bella's breath hitched as Max's hand slid up her back, his touch grounding her as he held her against his chest. Bella rested her head against Max's shoulder as his lips pressed softly to her hair. Despite the uncertainty that lay beyond the palace gates, Bella knew one thing with absolute certainty. Max loved her. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she belonged. The royal courtyard shimmered beneath the soft glow of golden lights as the sun descended behind the towering spires of the palace, casting hues of amber and violet across the twilight sky. The air was scented with the delicate fragrance of white roses, thousands of them, meticulously arranged along the marble pathways, their petals glowing beneath the twinkling fairy lights, draped across the arched trellises and ancient stone columns. Velvet red carpets stretched elegantly from the grand staircase to the heart of the courtyard, where a polished ivory platform gleamed beneath the soft candlelight, flickering from golden candelabras. The soft hum of violins floated through the evening air, blending with the faint rustling of the evening breeze as it carried the scent of roses and jasmine through the courtyard. Bella stood at the edge of the platform, her smooth brown skin radiant beneath the lights, her long braided hair cascading down her back in intricate waves of elegance. She wore a floor-length gown of deep crimson silk that hugged her slender figure perfectly, the delicate sheen of the fabric shimmering with every subtle movement. The dress clung to her curves, the off-shoulder neckline leaving her smooth collarbones and graceful neck exposed. The diamond pendant Max had gifted her days ago sparkled at her throat, but it was nothing compared to the way her deep brown eyes glowed with quiet vulnerability and wonder as she stood beneath the dazzling canopy of stars. Max stood before her, his tall frame dressed in a tailored black suit with intricate gold embroidery lining the edges of his jacket, his blue eyes burning with intensity beneath the soft glow of the courtyard lights. His beautifully groomed beard framed the sharp perfection of his jawline, and the gentle breeze tousled his dark hair as his gaze fixed solely on Bella, as though she were the only person in the world. The crowd of nobles and dignitaries surrounding the courtyard had grown silent, their attention drawn toward the prince and the breathtaking woman before him. Bella's heart hammered painfully in her chest as Max stepped toward her, his expression raw and vulnerable beneath the mask of royal composure. He reached out, his strong hand brushing over her trembling fingers as he guided her to the center of the platform. Bella's breath hitched as Max's hands slid down to her waist, pulling her closer until their bodies nearly touched. "Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the soft strains of the violins. His blue eyes softened as he smiled. "Shh," he whispered, his thumb brushing tenderly over her cheek. "I need you to hear me." Bella's eyes widened as Max slowly lowered himself to one knee, his strong hands still holding hers as he knelt before her. A soft gasp rippled through the gathered crowd, followed by a hush so profound that even the sound of the evening breeze seemed to still. Bella's hands flew to her mouth as Max's gaze lifted toward hers, his expression stripped bare of all royal pretense and formality. "Bella," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion. "From the moment I saw you, I knew you were different. You were not part of this world, and yet you became the center of mine. You walked into my life with quiet grace and fierce strength, and you tore down every wall I had built around my heart." His hands tightened over hers as his gaze burned into hers with breathtaking intensity. "You've shown me what love is. You've taught me how to feel, how to hope, how to breathe. You've given me something I never thought I would have: happiness. Bella's eyes filled with tears as Max's voice broke slightly, his strong jaw tightening as he fought the emotion in his throat. I don't care where you came from. I don't care about the crown or the court. All I care about is you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Bella's breath caught painfully as Max flipped open the lid to reveal a stunning diamond ring, a brilliant cut stone surrounded by smaller diamonds set in a delicate gold band that shimmered beneath the courtyard lights. "Bella," Max whispered, his voice trembling as his blue eyes softened with a rare vulnerability. "I am asking you, not as a prince, but as a man who is utterly and irrevocably in love with you. Will you marry me? Will you make me the luckiest man in the world and be my princess?" Bella's breath hitched as tears spilled down her cheeks, her hand trembling as Max held out the ring toward her. For a single breathless moment, time seemed to stand still. Then Bella's lips parted in a trembling smile and she whispered, "Yes." A collective gasp rippled through the courtyard, followed by an eruption of applause and cheers. But Bella only saw Max, his bright blue eyes widening with joy as his mouth curved into a breathtaking smile. Max slipped the ring onto her finger with careful reverence, then surged to his feet, sweeping Bella into his arms as his mouth claimed hers in a deep, passionate kiss. Bella melted into him, her arms winding around his neck as Max's hand slid down her back, anchoring her to him. "You're mine," Max whispered against her lips, his breath ragged as his forehead pressed against hers. "Forever." Bella's hands curled into his jacket as Max's lips found hers again, deeper this time, filled with promise and devotion. The roar of the crowd and the flash of the cameras barely registered as Max's arms tightened around her waist. "You've made me the happiest man in the world," Max whispered as he pulled away, just enough to brush his lips over her trembling jawline. Bella's smile trembled as her hand lifted to his cheek, her thumb brushing over the stubble of his beard. "I love you," she whispered. Max's blue eyes darkened as his smile widened. "Say it again." "I love you," Bella repeated, her voice breaking as Max's hands framed her face. "I love you so much, Max." His mouth found hers again, and the world melted away. The bells of the palace tower began to chime, announcing the engagement of Prince Max and his future princess. Max's hand slid down to Bella's waist as he turned toward the crowd, his expression fierce and proud as he held her close. "She's mine," Max said, his voice ringing through the courtyard. "And no one will take her from me." Bella's heart soared as Max leaned down, his mouth brushing her ear. "I'm going to make you so happy, Bella," he whispered. "Forever." Bella smiled through her tears as Max led her down the platform, his hand clasped firmly in hers. Bella glanced down at the diamond glittering on her finger, her heart swelling with joy as Max pulled her close, his mouth brushing over her ear. "You've made me the happiest man alive," Max whispered. Bella smiled as Max's lips captured hers once more, sealing the promise of forever. Bella stood at the edge of the opulent dining hall, her slender fingers trembling as they brushed against the folds of her ivory silk gown. The grand chandeliers overhead shimmered with thousands of delicate crystals, casting soft halos of golden light across the massive mahogany table adorned with fine china, polished silverware, and intricate floral centerpieces of white roses and crimson peonies. The long hall was filled with nobles, dignitaries, and foreign royalty seated beneath the high vaulted ceilings lined with gold leaf and tapestries of ancient battles and royal triumphs. The air buzzed with the low hum of sophisticated conversation and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses, but Bella could barely hear it over the frantic hammering of her heart. She sat at Max's side, her place marked by a delicate nameplate etched in gold script. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface of her wine glass, smooth brown skin glowing beneath the candlelight, her long braided hair coiled elegantly over one shoulder. She wore a diamond tiara gifted by Max on the morning of their engagement, the glint of the precious stones illuminating the quiet vulnerability in her wide, dark eyes. Across the table, Lady Vivian, a duchess with high cheekbones and ice blue eyes, smirked faintly as Bella reached for her glass of water. Bella's fingers trembled, causing the glass to wobble and nearly tip over. A soft ripple of polite laughter followed, and Bella's cheeks flamed with humiliation. Her gaze darted toward Max, whose sharp blue eyes narrowed dangerously at Lady Vivian. "Careful, Lady Vivian." Max's voice cut through the room, cool and edged with authority. "I don't believe clumsiness is a crime." Vivian's smile faltered as Max's eyes hardened, his hand resting protectively over Bella's trembling fingers. But even Max's quiet strength couldn't settle the knot in Bella's stomach as the dinner progressed. The conversation drifted toward politics and foreign affairs, complex, layered discussions filled with names, treaties, and policies that Bella could barely follow. When the Duke of Everley directed a question toward her about Valoria's trade relations with the Eastern Kingdom, Bella's mind went blank. Her throat tightened as the hall grew unnervingly silent. "Well?" the Duke prompted, arching a graying brow. Bella's lips parted, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on her, judgment radiating from the nobles who had lived their entire lives within the gilded cage of royalty. Heat crept up Bella's neck as she dropped her gaze to her lap, shame washing over her in waves. "That's enough," Max said coolly, his arm tightening around Bella's shoulders. "My fiancé is not here to be interrogated." But the damage was done. Bella could feel it in the condescending glances that lingered too long and the stifled whispers that followed her as she excused herself from the table. Her heart thudded painfully as she fled the hall, her silk slippers echoing against the polished marble floors as she climbed the sweeping staircase leading to the palace balcony. Cool evening air wrapped around her as Bella leaned against the gilded railing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Below, the palace gardens stretched out beneath the starlit sky, rows of crimson roses illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes as she pressed her forehead against the cool metal. What was she doing here? She didn't belong in this world of crowns and politics. She was a waitress from the city, a girl who knew how to carry a tray of coffee cups, not navigate royal alliances and diplomatic banquets. Bella closed her eyes, her breath hitching as a tear slipped down her cheek. Footsteps echoed behind her, followed by the quiet rustle of fabric. A warm hand settled on her waist, and Bella tensed before the familiar scent of Max's cologne wrapped around her, dark spice and sandalwood. "Bella," Max's voice was low, coaxing as he turned her toward him. His blue eyes softened as his thumb brushed beneath her eye, catching the stray tear. "Talk to me," he murmured. Bella's chest tightened as she shook her head. "I don't belong here, Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to sit at those tables or talk about treaties. I don't understand their politics. I feel stupid." Max's eyes darkened as his hands slid to her waist, pulling her closer until their bodies touched. "Don't you dare say that," he growled. Bella's breath caught as his hand lifted to her cheek, tilting her face toward him. "You are not stupid," Max said fiercely. "You are the smartest, most graceful woman I have ever known." "I embarrassed you tonight," Bella whispered. "They were laughing at me." Max's gaze hardened. "Let them," he said, his voice dark with quiet authority. "Let them laugh because they'll never have what I have, you. You're not here to impress them, Bella. You're here because I love you." Bella's heart thudded painfully as Max's hands framed her face. "You're not a duchess or a diplomat," Max said, his gaze burning into hers. You're not a polished royal raised to play games with foreign kings, but you're the woman who walked into my life and changed it. You're the woman who looked me in the eye when I was at my worst and loved me anyway." His thumb traced her cheek as his lips hovered over hers. "I don't want perfection, Bella. I don't want someone who knows how to sit at those tables and speak in circles. I want you." Bella's breath hitched as Max's mouth brushed over hers. "You don't have to change for me, Bella," he whispered. "I don't need you to be like them. I need you to be you." Bella's chest tightened painfully as Max's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest. His lips pressed to her temple, lingering there as his hands settled at the small of her back. "Don't let them make you feel small," Max said quietly. "You're not small. You're the strongest person I know." Bella's lips trembled as her fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" Max's hand slid up to cradle the back of her head. "Of failing you." Max's blue eyes softened as his lips tilted into a faint smile. "Impossible," he whispered. He leaned down, brushing his mouth over hers in a slow, deep kiss. Bella's breath trembled as Max pulled away just enough to whisper, "You've already given me more than I ever dreamed of, Bella. You don't have to prove yourself. Just stay." Bella's heart swelled painfully as Max's forehead pressed against hers. Slowly, her arms lifted to circle his neck, her fingers sliding through the dark waves of his hair. "I love you," she whispered. Max's breath hitched as his eyes darkened. "Say it again." "I love you," Bella repeated, her voice stronger this time. A slow smile curved across Max's mouth as he kissed her deeply, his arms tightening around her. Bella melted into him, her heart pounding as Max lifted her into his arms, carrying her away from the balcony beneath the soft glow of the stars. "I love you exactly as you are," Max whispered against her ear. Bella's eyes fluttered closed as Max's lips brushed over her temple. "And I always will." Bella sat curled on the edge of the plush velvet chaise in the royal sitting room, the golden light of the late afternoon sun filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the palace gardens. Her trembling fingers gripped the tabloid as her wide, dark eyes scanned the glossy page for the 100th time. The headline blared across the top in bold red letters. "Prince Max reunites with former flame, Lady Amelia." The accompanying photograph was painfully clear. Max in his tailored navy suit, his strong arm resting around Lady Amelia's slender waist as they stood side by side at a charity gala the night before. Amelia, with her cascading blonde curls and sharp green eyes, was smiling coyly up at Max as if she belonged at his side. Bella's chest constricted painfully, her heart hammering beneath the silk of her ivory blouse. Her mind raced with doubts and insecurities, the cold edge of fear wrapping around her throat like a noose. She'd been trying so hard to find her place in Max's world, learning the customs, adjusting to palace life, standing beside him at endless diplomatic functions. But now it felt as if the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. The door creaked open, and Max's tall figure strode into the room, his sharp blue eyes immediately finding Bella's distressed face. "Bella?" His deep voice was laced with concern as he crossed the room in long, powerful strides. Bella's breath hitched as he sank onto the chaise beside her, his hand reaching for hers, but she flinched, clutching the tabloid tightly to her chest. "Is it true?" Bella's voice was barely above a whisper, trembling with the weight of her fear. Max's brow furrowed as his gaze dropped to the article in her hands. His jaw tightened, and a cold, dangerous edge sharpened his blue eyes. "Where did you get this?" Bella's lower lip trembled as she held out the tabloid. "It's everywhere," she whispered. "Everyone's talking about it. You, with Lady Amelia." Her voice cracked over the name. Max's face hardened. He took the tabloid from her hand, his eyes darkening as he scanned the article. "This is garbage," he growled, his hand curling into a fist around the paper. "Amelia means nothing to me." Bella's gaze wavered as fresh tears welled in her eyes. "Then why were you with her? Why is there a picture of you holding her like that?" Her voice was filled with raw vulnerability, exposing the cracks in her heart. Max's gaze softened as he reached for her face, his thumb brushing away a tear trailing down her cheek. "Bella," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I was at the gala because I had to be. It was a diplomatic event. Amelia approached me. I didn't seek her out. I would never." His jaw tightened and his hands slid to cup her face, forcing her gaze to meet his. "You have to believe me. Amelia doesn't matter. She never did. You are the only woman I want." Bella's breath hitched as Max's thumbs stroked over her cheeks, his eyes burning with fierce intensity. "But the rumors," she whispered. Max's eyes darkened with a dangerous glint. "Amelia has always been manipulative. She wants the crown, but she's never had my heart." His hands slid down to her shoulders, his grip possessive and grounding. "And she never will." Bella's heart twisted painfully as Max's gaze darkened with raw fury. "Who started these rumors?" Bella whispered. Max's jaw clenched. "Amelia," he said darkly. "I should have seen it coming." He stood abruptly, his powerful frame radiating tension as he ran a hand through his dark hair. "This ends now." Bella watched as Max strode toward the door, his expression sharp and lethal. "Max," she called after him, her voice trembling. He turned, his gaze burning into hers. "Stay here," he ordered softly. "I'm going to handle this." Before Bella could respond, Max was gone, his long strides echoing down the marble hallway. Bella sat frozen, her heart racing wildly as fear and uncertainty warred within her chest. Moments passed, minutes that felt like an eternity, before the sound of raised voices reached her ears from the palace hall. Bella's breath hitched as the massive double doors to the main hall were thrown open. A small crowd of nobles and royal staff stood gathered in a loose circle near the marble staircase. In the center stood Lady Amelia, her emerald silk gown cascading around her as she tilted her chin arrogantly. Her green eyes gleamed with thinly veiled triumph. "Max, I don't understand why you're so upset," Amelia purred, her red lips curling into a coy smile. "It's only natural that people would assume..." "Assume what?" Max's voice was cold, lethal. He stood before her, his broad shoulders squared, his piercing blue gaze burning with ice. "That you and I are together? That you have some claim over me?" Amelia's smile faltered. "Well, we do have history." "History," Max cut in sharply, his voice dripping with disdain. "You mean the handful of events my parents forced me to attend with you when I was too young to know better?" Amelia's eyes flashed with annoyance. "Max." "Enough," Max growled. His eyes blazed with fierce intensity as he stepped forward, his tall frame towering over her. "I don't love you, Amelia. I never have." Amelia's mouth twisted, her green eyes darkening. "But the crown..." "I don't care about the crown," Max cut in harshly. His gaze flicked toward the staircase and toward Bella, who stood frozen at the edge of the hall, her dark eyes wide with fear and hope. Max's chest heaved as his gaze locked with Bella's. Without hesitation, he strode toward her, pushing through the gathered nobles and ignoring the murmurs of shock that erupted around them. He reached Bella in 3 long strides, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her against him. "This is the only woman I care about," Max said, his voice sharp and clear. "Bella is the woman I love." A collective gasp rippled through the hall as Max's hand slid up to frame Bella's face. "No rumors, no scandals, no past connections will ever change that," he said fiercely. Bella's breath trembled as Max leaned down, his mouth capturing hers in a searing, passionate kiss. Bella melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest as Max deepened the kiss, claiming her in front of the entire court. When Max finally pulled away, his gaze darkened with raw possession. "Bella is my future," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And anyone who threatens her, threatens me." His gaze flicked toward Amelia, whose face had paled beneath the harsh glow of the chandeliers. "This ends tonight, Amelia," Max said coldly. "Leave my court and stay out of my life." Amelia's green eyes flashed with anger, but Max's gaze remained unyielding. After a long moment, Amelia turned on her heel and stormed out of the hall, her silk skirts trailing behind her. Bella's heart hammered as Max's hand slid down to entwine with hers. "Max," she whispered. He turned toward her, his blue eyes softening. "Did you mean it?" she whispered. Max's lips curved faintly as he brushed his thumb across her cheek. "Every word," he murmured. "You're mine, Bella, and no one is going to take you from me." Bella's chest squeezed as Max's mouth brushed over hers in a slow, lingering kiss. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "Forever." Bella stood in the royal dressing chamber, the moonlight casting a soft, silvery glow through the tall arched windows. The room was bathed in quiet luxury. Soft cream-colored silk draped the high ceilings, and gilded mirrors lined the marble walls, reflecting the shimmer of her white satin gown. The gown flowed around her like liquid moonlight, the delicate beadwork at the bodice catching the light with each slow breath she took. Her hands trembled as she traced the smooth satin of her waist, the fitted corset highlighting the soft curve of her figure. Bella's dark eyes shimmered with uncertainty as she stared at her reflection. Tomorrow she would stand before the entire kingdom, before foreign dignitaries and nobles, and pledge herself to Max in front of the crown. Her heart raced with a heady mix of fear and exhilaration. Could she truly step into this role, into this life? Her chest tightened as she lifted a trembling hand to her throat, her breath catching at the enormity of it all. The heavy golden tiara on the velvet cushion behind her seemed to radiate the weight of expectation. Her heart hammered as doubts whispered through her mind. She was just a waitress from the village, an orphan who had spent her life struggling to survive. How could she possibly become the princess that Max deserved, the queen the kingdom needed? A soft creak of the chamber doors pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. Her gaze lifted to the mirror as Max's tall, commanding frame appeared behind her. His dark blue suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the crisp white shirt beneath it open at the collar. His golden brown hair was slightly tousled, and his piercing blue eyes darkened as they roamed over her figure. "Bella," he said softly, his deep voice a low caress that sent shivers down her spine. His gaze swept over her, drinking in the way the satin clung to her curves, the way the soft candlelight illuminated her delicate features. Slowly, Max crossed the marble floor toward her, his polished shoes echoing in the quiet room. Bella's breath hitched as he stopped behind her, his chest so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His large hands slid gently over her bare shoulders, his thumbs brushing the sensitive skin near her collarbones. Bella's eyes fluttered closed as a soft tremor ran through her. "You're shaking," Max whispered against her ear. His breath was warm against her skin, his lips grazing the sensitive spot beneath her ear. Bella's eyes opened, meeting his intense gaze through the mirror. "I'm scared," she admitted softly, her voice trembling. Max's expression softened, his hands sliding down to her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Of what?" he asked quietly. Bella's eyes dropped. "Of not being enough, of not fitting into this world, of embarrassing you, of letting you down." Max's gaze darkened with quiet intensity. "Look at me," he murmured. Bella hesitated before slowly lifting her gaze to his reflection. Max's hands slid down over her waist, his grip possessive yet gentle. "You could never embarrass me," he said, his voice low and firm. "You belong here, Bella, not because of your birth or your title, but because you're the woman I love. You're the only one who makes me feel alive, the only one who's ever seen me for who I am, not the prince, not the crown, but the man beneath it." Bella's heart squeezed painfully as his words wrapped around her like a balm. "Max," she whispered. He lowered his head, his lips pressing against the exposed curve of her neck. "You are enough," he said against her skin, his voice rough with emotion. "You always have been." Bella's breath shuddered as his hands slid down over her hips, pulling her body flush against his. "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," Max murmured, his lips tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "Inside and out." Bella's eyes welled with tears as his hands curved around her waist, holding her tightly against him. His lips moved along the column of her neck, planting soft, lingering kisses that sent heat curling low in her belly. "Tomorrow," Max whispered, his mouth brushing over her ear, "you become my queen." Bella turned in his arms, her hands sliding up over his broad chest. Max's blue eyes burned with fierce intensity as she lifted her gaze to his. "And you'll be my king," she whispered. A low growl rumbled in Max's throat as his hands cupped her face. "Say it again," he demanded softly, his gaze sharp with need. Bella's lips curved into a soft smile. "My king," she whispered. A muscle ticked in Max's jaw before his mouth crashed down on hers. Bella melted beneath him, her hands threading into his hair as his lips claimed hers with deep, searing possession. His tongue slid between her lips, coaxing her open, tasting her as though he couldn't get enough. Bella's knees weakened and Max's arms tightened around her, lifting her against him as the kiss deepened. Her hands slid over his chest, feeling the heat of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt. Max pulled back just enough to press his forehead against hers, his breath ragged. "You have no idea how much I want you right now," he growled, his hands sliding down over her hips. Bella's cheeks flushed, her heart pounding wildly. "Max, tell me to stop," he whispered. "Tell me to walk away, and I will." Bella's eyes darkened as her hands slid over his jaw. "Don't stop," she whispered. Max's eyes flashed dangerously as he lifted her into his arms and carried her across the room. Bella's breath hitched as he laid her down on the chaise lounge, his large frame looming over hers. His mouth descended on hers again, his hands sliding over the satin of her gown. Bella arched into his touch, heat coiling through her veins as Max's lips traced a slow path down the curve of her neck. "I can't wait until tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with need. "When you're mine. Completely. Forever." Bella's hands threaded into his hair as his lips moved lower, his hands sliding over the soft silk of her gown. "I'm already yours," she whispered. Max's gaze burned into hers as he brushed a lock of dark hair behind her ear. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low and rough, "I'm going to make you my queen in every way imaginable." Bella's heart swelled as Max leaned down, his lips brushing over hers in a soft, lingering kiss. "I love you, Bella," he whispered. Bella's breath shuddered as she traced her fingertips over his jaw. "I love you too, Max." His blue eyes darkened as he pulled her into another deep kiss, sealing his promise with the taste of forever. The Grand Cathedral of Valoria stood like a towering monument to centuries of tradition and royalty, its ancient stone walls adorned with intricate carvings and golden embellishments that glimmered beneath the cascading light from the massive stained glass windows. The air was thick with the heady scent of fresh white roses, their delicate petals scattered along the crimson velvet aisle that stretched from the massive oak doors to the towering altar. Hundreds of nobles, dignitaries, and members of the royal court filled the pews, their elegant silk and velvet gowns whispering softly as they turned their heads toward the back of the cathedral, waiting with bated breath. The deep, resonant notes of the cathedral's grand pipe organ swelled through the cavernous space, a haunting and majestic melody that sent shivers through the crowd. Golden sunlight filtered through the high-arched windows, casting a heavenly glow over the marble floors and illuminating the gilded chandeliers that hung above like delicate crystal stars. Bella stood at the entrance of the cathedral, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might shatter through her chest. Her slender fingers gripped the edges of her bouquet, white roses and lilies intertwined with delicate ivy, tied together with a silk ribbon that trembled between her hands. The gown she wore was a masterpiece of elegance, a creation of soft white satin that hugged her slender waist and flowed down into a long, regal train embroidered with thousands of tiny pearls and crystals that glittered like a field of stars beneath the cathedral's soft light. Her dark hair was swept back into an intricate twist, adorned with a diamond-encrusted tiara that had once belonged to Max's grandmother, a symbol of acceptance into the royal family. Her dark eyes shimmered with emotion as she took a trembling breath. And then the cathedral doors opened, and the music shifted into the soft, familiar strains of the wedding march. Bella's heart stopped as Max turned toward her. He stood at the altar, tall and breathtaking in his royal attire. His tailored black uniform was lined with gold, the deep crimson sash of his royal house draped across his broad chest. His hair was perfectly styled, his golden brown beard neatly groomed, highlighting the sharp cut of his jaw. His piercing blue eyes burned into hers, the intensity of his gaze making her knees weak. Max's mouth curved into a soft smile, his expression raw with love as he watched her take her first step down the aisle. Bella's father, her hand resting on his arm, walked beside her with quiet pride. Her heart hammered as Max's gaze never wavered from hers, his blue eyes dark with reverence, as though she was the only thing that existed in the world. Each step brought her closer to him, the weight of the cathedral's history pressing down on her, the sheer enormity of this moment stealing her breath. Whispers rippled through the crowd, whispers of awe at Bella's beauty, at the simplicity yet profound elegance of her gown, at the soft, trembling smile on her lips. Bella's eyes burned with tears as she reached the end of the aisle, her trembling hand slipping from her father's arm as Max stepped toward her. His strong, calloused hand closed around hers, his grip steady and warm. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Bella's lips trembled as Max led her up the marble steps to the altar, where the archbishop stood beneath the towering golden crucifix. The hush that settled over the cathedral was palpable, the only sound the steady rise and fall of their breath. Max's hands remained clasped tightly around hers, his thumbs brushing soothingly over her knuckles. The archbishop's voice resonated through the cathedral. "Prince Maximilian of Valoria, do you take Lady Bella as your wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, from this day forward until death do you part?" Max's jaw tightened, his blue eyes darkening with fierce devotion. "With my whole heart, yes," he said, his deep voice reverberating through the cavernous space. A soft gasp rippled through the crowd as Max's intense gaze never wavered from Bella's face. Bella's lips parted, her heart thundering as the archbishop turned to her. "Lady Bella, do you take Prince Maximilian as your husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, from this day forward until death do you part?" Bella's breath hitched as Max's gaze softened, his hands tightening around hers. A single tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Yes." Max's breath shuddered from his chest, his jaw tightening as emotion flashed through his gaze. The archbishop nodded solemnly, lifting his hands in blessing. "By the power vested in me by the crown and the church, I now pronounce you husband and wife." You may now kiss the bride." A tremor passed through Max's broad frame as he pulled Bella toward him. His hand slid into her hair, cupping the back of her head as he lowered his mouth to hers. The instant their lips touched, the cathedral erupted into a cascade of cheers and applause. Bella melted into his kiss, her hands curling around the lapels of his uniform as Max deepened the kiss, his mouth moving over hers with desperate reverence and fierce possession. A soft moan escaped her lips as his hand slid down her back, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. When Max finally pulled back, his eyes were dark with raw need, his breathing ragged. He pressed his forehead to hers, his hands framing her face. "Mine," he whispered, his voice rough. Bella's eyes shimmered as she whispered, "Forever." Max's mouth curled into a fierce smile as he kissed her again, lifting her into his arms as the crowd cheered wildly. White rose petals rained down from the ceiling, fluttering around them like soft snowflakes as Max carried her down the aisle. Nobles and dignitaries clapped, some wiping tears from their eyes at the sheer intensity of the moment. Outside the cathedral, the royal guard stood at attention, swords raised in a ceremonial arch, as Max carried Bella down the grand marble steps. The bright sunlight bathed them in golden warmth as they emerged into the palace square, where thousands of Valorian citizens had gathered to witness the royal wedding. A thunderous cheer rose from the crowd as Max lowered Bella to her feet, his hands never leaving her waist. He turned to face the crowd, his arm wrapped possessively around Bella's waist. "I present to you Princess Bella of Valoria." Max's voice boomed over the square. Bella's cheeks flushed as the crowd erupted into another deafening cheer. Max turned toward her, his eyes burning with devotion as he lowered his mouth to hers once more. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. Bella smiled, her heart swelling with joy. "I love you too." And as Max's lips claimed hers again beneath the golden sunlight and the roar of their kingdom's love, Bella knew with absolute certainty that she had found her forever. Bella woke to the soft morning light filtering through the sheer curtains of their grand royal chamber, the golden rays casting a warm glow over the satin sheets and the intricately carved canopy above their bed. The air was thick with the lingering scent of roses from the garden below, and the distant hum of the palace fountains drifted through the open balcony doors. Bella's dark lashes fluttered open, her heart swelling as she felt the comforting weight of Max's strong arm wrapped protectively around her waist. His bare chest pressed against her back, the heat of his body enveloping her like a shield from the world. Bella smiled, her heart thudding softly as she twisted in his embrace, her fingers sliding over the smooth ridges of his chest. Max stirred, his blue eyes fluttering open, darkened by the haze of sleep. His golden brown hair was tousled, a soft rumble escaping his throat as he tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer until their faces were mere inches apart. "Good morning, my love," Max murmured, his voice low and rough with sleep. Bella smiled, her hand sliding up to trace the sharp line of his jaw. "Max," she whispered, her heart racing. "I have something to tell you." Max's brow furrowed, his sleepy gaze sharpening as he pushed himself up on his elbow, his blue eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. "What is it, Bella?" Bella's heart fluttered wildly, her hand slid down to rest on her abdomen, her fingers splaying across the soft silk of her nightgown. "I'm pregnant," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with tears. Max's breath hitched, his eyes widening in stunned disbelief. "What?" Bella's lips trembled as a single tear slipped down her cheek. "We're going to have a baby." Max froze, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths as her words sank in. His mouth parted, his eyes darkening with fierce emotion. And then, without warning, he crushed her against his chest, his strong arms wrapping around her so tightly Bella could barely breathe. "Oh my God, Bella," Max breathed, his voice rough with reverence. Resting over her abdomen, his palm pressing gently against the soft curve of her stomach. His eyes shimmered with unshed tears as he leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her lips. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Bella's hands framed his face as she kissed him deeply, her lips trembling against his. "And I love you." Max's mouth curved into a fierce smile as he rested his forehead against hers, his hand still protectively covering her stomach. "You're carrying our child," he whispered, wonder filling his voice. "Our baby." Bella's heart swelled as Max lowered his mouth to her abdomen, pressing a reverent kiss to the silk of her nightgown. "Thank you," he whispered against her skin. "Thank you for giving me everything I never knew I needed." Bella's fingers sank into his hair as tears slipped down her cheeks, overwhelmed by the depth of his love. "You're going to be an incredible father," she whispered. Max lifted his gaze, his blue eyes burning with intensity. "And you're going to be the most beautiful mother." His hand moved to cradle her face as he kissed her again, this time with slow, aching tenderness. Bella melted into him, her heart soaring as Max shifted, pulling her beneath him. His lips traced the line of her jaw, down her neck, until he pressed another lingering kiss over her abdomen. "I can't believe this," he whispered. "You and me, starting a family." Bella laughed softly, her fingers curling into his hair. "Believe it." Max's mouth curled into a slow smile. "I love you, Bella," he murmured, his hand sliding beneath her nightgown to caress the soft skin of her waist. Bella shivered beneath his touch, her lips parting. "I love you too." Max's hand moved to cradle her face as he kissed her with quiet reverence, his body pressing her into the soft sheets. "You've made me the luckiest man in the world," he whispered. Bella smiled through her tears. "You've made me the happiest woman." Max kissed her temple, his lips lingering there as his hand slid over her stomach once more. "Our baby," he murmured, "a part of you and me." Bella's heart swelled as Max pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. Outside the balcony, the sound of the fountains mixed with the soft rustling of the trees as a gentle breeze drifted through the room. Bella closed her eyes, her hand resting over Max's as they both held the new life growing inside her. "Forever," Max whispered, his lips brushing her ear. "Forever," Bella echoed. Max's mouth curled into a smile as he kissed her once more, their bodies entwined beneath the golden morning light. "You're my queen," he whispered, "my everything." Bella's lips trembled as she whispered, "And you're my king." Max's eyes darkened with fierce devotion, "And our child will know nothing but love." Bella's heart filled with warmth as Max kissed her again, his mouth lingering over hers. "We'll give our baby everything," he promised, "everything they could ever need." Bella smiled, her hand sliding over his heart. "All they need is love." Max's eyes softened. "Then they'll have more than enough." Bella sighed contentedly as Max pulled her closer, his strong arms wrapped protectively around her. "I can't wait to meet them," Bella whispered. Max smiled against her hair. "Neither can I." They lay together in the quiet morning light, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. And as Max's hand slid protectively over her abdomen, Bella knew with absolute certainty that this was only the beginning of their forever. From a simple waitress to a princess, to the future mother of the next heir to the throne, Bella's life had transformed in ways she'd never imagined. And yet, it had all led her here, to Max, to love, to the quiet promise of a future built on devotion and passion. As the golden morning sunlight poured over them, Max kissed her once more, his lips lingering on hers as he whispered, "Thank you, Bella." Bella's eyes shimmered as she whispered, "Thank you, Max." And as they lay together beneath the warmth of the rising sun, their hands resting protectively over the new life they had created, Bella smiled, knowing that their love story, born from chance, strengthened through trials, and sealed with devotion, would last forever. Special thanks to all of you for joining Bella and Max's incredible journey of love, passion, and devotion. May God bless you all abundantly in the mighty name of Jesus. Thank you for watching.